Welcome, everyone. We'll just give a minute to let people get into the virtual room. We welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started in about 30 seconds or so. Okay. Whoops, I already got ahead of myself. I was so excited to start. My name is Jennifer Groth. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships with Rural Development Initiatives. We are so excited to have you with us today to talk about volunteer recruitment and retention in rural places. I also want to make sure that I introduce Jess Black, who is a colleague of mine and who will be helping run the session today. So thank you, Jess. We also have some great panelists that I'm going to introduce in just a minute. So for those of you who are not familiar with Rural Development Initiatives, we are an organization that's worked in the Pacific Northwest for 30 years. We support rural people, places, and economies. If you would like more information about our programs and services, I welcome you to peruse our website at rdiinc.org. I also want to take a moment to thank the funders who are supporting this session. We have the Ford Family Foundation, who's a great rural funder in Oregon and Siskiyou County, California, and also the Association of Washington Cities. I know we have all been on a lot of Zoom calls at this point, but just a few reminders to keep muted when you're not speaking. We absolutely welcome you to use the chat feature for questions and comments or resources that come to mind during the presentation. And we also invite you to use the speaker view, which is a little button up in the right-hand corner of the screen. So that way you can see who is speaking a little bit more easily. I want to talk for a minute about why RDI is hosting these webinars. After the events of 2020 and beyond, we saw a need to organize a series of community conversations. We wanted to elevate the discussion around issues that are important to rural places. We encourage you to check out our website to see what topics have been of interest and also to listen to past recordings if you'd like. So the Great Resignation has not only impacted workplaces, we also see the pandemic impacts of social isolation in our community work reflected in depleted boards, fewer volunteers, and overworked nonprofit staff. This session is going to provide some tools to help re-engage the vitally important rural volunteer base through both time-tested and new approaches to volunteer recruitment and retention. And Jess did a little bit of research in anticipation and found some interesting data points that you see on the screen here related to what we're seeing post-pandemic relative to volunteerism. Okay, so I want to introduce our super awesome panelists. First, we have Maria Fabula from the Community Resource Center. She has spent her career connecting government, nonprofit organizations, and businesses to improve community, has over 2 decades of experience in these sectors. Since 2013, she's served as the president and CEO of the Community Resource Center in Colorado. Her leadership has led to the transformation of the Rural Philanthropy Days program. In addition, the addition of an AmeriCorps Vista program and the acquisition of the Colorado Participation Project and the nonprofit Social Enterprise Exchange. And lastly, she was involved in the launching of the Colorado COVID-19 Retainment Corps and the Colorado Healthcare Corps. She was appointed in 2014 to the Governor's Commission on Community Service and served as the commission chair from 2018 to 2020. Next, we have Adam Lounsbury, the Executive Director of the Iowa Commission on Volunteer Service. He was appointed by Governor Vilsack in 2003 and subsequently retained by Governors Culver, Branstad, and Reynolds. He's helped to maintain a bipartisan commitment to volunteerism in Iowa for 19 years. As the Director of Volunteer Iowa, he's led efforts to increase national service and volunteer opportunities in the state while helping organizations utilize service as a strategy to fulfill their mission. He's a lifelong Iowan. He's a graduate of Iowa State University and began his career in national service following the floods in 1993, where he served with the Iowa Conservation Corps. Last but not least, we have our very own Heidi Khokhar, the Executive Director of Rural Development Initiatives. I will say that we typically don't have members of our staff participate in this panels, but we felt compelled to make an exception in this case because Heidi has a wealth of experience on this particular topic, as well as many others, of course. She has passionately served rural for over 20 years, is strongly committed to developing diverse, skilled, and connected local leaders, sustainable economic revitalization efforts, and elevating rural voices and priorities. She's been our executive director since 2016 and has been working to build leadership, encourage prosperity in rural communities since 1998, and with a focus on community engagement. Her experience includes facilitating community-wide planning, engagement, and organizing efforts, designing and delivering the Rural Community Leadership Program, and originating RDI's 600-person volunteer corps, the Rural Community Ambassador Network. So welcome to our great panelists. So I am going to take the screen down in a minute so we can see more faces, because I think that probably makes for a better discussion. But I will tell you that I have some planned questions to sort of get the ball rolling, but I do welcome you to enter your questions in the chat, and Jess and I will attempt to pull those into the conversation as much as we can. So to get started, I'm just going to ask a general question of our panel to ask them to tell us about their recent experiences working with volunteers and possibly what they see that is different about volunteering in rural places. Heidi, I'm wondering if you mind if we start with you.
So I thank you for the introduction, and I feel like that sometimes RDI's full job is related to rural volunteers and increasing rural volunteerism, and quite honestly, it's the foundation of RDI's theory of change, that it is by strengthening the capacity of those local people to get involved in their own community and engage with the issues and matters and the others who are involved, it just underpins everything we do. Of course, we started as an economic development organization, but it was the local people that were going to need to make all that happen, and that still remains true. And so I would say, related to what makes volunteerism different in rural places, first of all, it's probably not. It's just that it's so vital in rural places, and often those volunteers are playing roles that in other places may be paid roles. They maybe have to have staff, but that they're coming in and picking up roles that are vital to their community going on. It's not whether envelopes will be stuffed, it's whether a community center will be funded, or whether the next police chief will be hired, or they're paying key roles, because your title is true. Rural does run on volunteers.
Great, thanks, Heidi, appreciate it. Maria, I wonder if I might ask you to provide some perspective on that question based on talking about what your recent experience has been and whether you think that a rural lens is important.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this great discussion with great panelists. In Colorado, we worked very diligently with our rural volunteers across the state over the past 2 years. So let's just talk about the pandemic times. We really leaned into those relationships because we know that those rural-based volunteers wear many hats in their communities, which is the name of the game in rural, right? There are less people and potentially more and different and unique needs. And the reality is that people in rural communities who are engaged are often engaged in many different organizations. They wear lots of hats, and it's important to tap into that asset of the community. And so, Community Resource Center, we are a statewide organization, but we do focus a significant amount of our capacity building resources and services to rural communities. And we really leaned into those relationships. We have about 200 rural-based leaders who come together who we ask to advise us on capacity building strategies specific for that part of the state. And as I know, all of you know, one rural part of your community, your state, is going to look very different than another part. So needs in the rural communities are different and diverse. I think that our biggest takeaway over the pandemic was the need to support those volunteers with very tangible takeaway capacity building resources. And sometimes that meant a link to a training or a resource online. Sometimes, and quite frankly, a lot of the time, it meant just listening and hearing the needs and troubleshooting, ideating with folks on the ground so that they could really understand what resources we had available and that they could be heard, because that's part of what we do is provide relevant resources. And in order to do that, we need to know what folks need. So I think it was really important for us and specific to our rural volunteers to spend the time building on the relationships that we've had, creating new relationships, and encouraging folks to connect about what their needs were.
Thanks, Maria. I can't tell you how many times during these community conversations the topic of relationship building has come up. It's just like the cornerstone of everything we do, I think. Adam, I want to give you an opportunity to speak from your perspective and experience in Iowa as well.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, so outside of leading a state agency that's charged with increasing volunteerism in a largely rural state, I'm actually from live in a town of 750 people. Was born and raised in a rural community and 8th generation rural Iowan. So really grew up around it and had the fabric and culture of kind of rural volunteerism and understand the nature of it and the reliance on volunteerism, especially in rural communities. From my perspective, in terms of what I see is different about volunteering in rural places, and this is both global and experiential, we know that the rural volunteers are aging. We're dealing with smaller pools. Rural communities are more interconnected, but than our urban areas, meaning they have more points of connection, but they also have it's also declined. People are less connected than they were even 20 years ago, where people are less likely to live, work, go to school, go to church, go to and in the same community, meaning there's less points of contact and less points of engagement, which is a new challenge for us. And also just that volunteerism is very much built into the culture. Key areas, key functions, from firefighting to EMS to most Iowans rely on if they have a heart attack, they rely on a volunteer to save their life, or their house burns down, or many of the key government jobs and from the city clerk are run by volunteers. So across the board, volunteerism is something that people, especially in rural areas, are really rely on. So.
Yeah, truth. And I think that really resonates with what we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest as well. So I imagine there's a lot that we all have in common with regard to our experience in rural. So we do have a question in the chat about hoping for some perspectives and information about recruiting racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse volunteers in rural. So we know that there was declining volunteerism during the pandemic, and now that we're seeing renewed interest and engagement going forward, I'm wondering how we make opportunities more equitable and inclusive to address that person's question. Maria, I know this is something you talked about as we were preparing for this session today. Would you like to lead us off and talk about what you think some answers or some ideas might be, and then we can let our other panelists chime in as they wish?
Absolutely, great question. So I would say, to start with, it's really important that within the culture of your organization that you are welcoming these diverse populations, right? we encourage our partners across the state to really think about what that means, because if your goal as an agency is to increase the diversity of your volunteer pool, let's just make sure that you're bringing that you have a welcoming environment to support that. We have seen some significant efforts by nonprofits in really increasing the amount of volunteers during this time when it feels like there are less volunteers or there are different priorities that people are focusing on. We have encouraged our partners to really adjust how they approach their outreach. What specific skills are they looking for? Are these opportunities available online, which we've all learned in the past couple of years how to do a lot more online. Is it possible to create or adjust that volunteer opportunity to appeal to someone who may not be able to physically be in your space, or they live, as in many rural communities, a long distance away, and it's a barrier for them to be in person. So adjusting your volunteer opportunities to really meet this new volunteer pool. So we heard earlier that volunteerism, we've seen a decrease, but we also know that we've seen an increase based on the statistics that you provided earlier in people, especially young people, in a civic engagement activity, right? So how do we appeal to this new younger generation that is very motivated by a meaningful experience? Do we rewrite a job description to help draw in those folks? From the vantage point of thinking about breaking down barriers, I think that this isn't new by any means, but I think it is certainly important to recognize how do we encourage folks who might have different kinds of barriers to volunteerism. Are there ways that we can help reduce those barriers? For example, if they are coming from a long distance, can we provide, as an organization, help with the cost of gas in attending, in being in person? What is the benefit for that volunteer? You know, I think, at least when I was growing up, which was a long time ago, when I was a little person, volunteerism was about the meaning for me and my family. It was about providing service, but it's also a strategic way to increase your capacity as an organization. So if someone is looking for a sense of belonging in your organization, how do you create that for them? That might be more important now than it ever was before, especially in our rural communities. So reducing those barriers are really important, and being creative about what that means to bring in those diverse volunteers in your programs and in your organizations.
That's great.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
leave it at have.
That's great. Thanks, Maria. I appreciate those good tidbits of advice. Heidi or Adam, do you want to add anything to what Maria has elucidated there?
Just real briefly, we've definitely over the years seen an interesting dynamic that, in just through the research and data we have over that the more diverse a community was, the less all the groups in the community volunteered, and which was a troubling statistic that which we actually saw the answer to that was that with intentional engagement we needed to bring people together. If you saw a polarization in a community, to bring people together through volunteering. Storm Lake actually provided a good example for us. It was our first Storm Lake, Iowa, which was our first majority minority community in Iowa. Kind of hit that mark 15 or 20 years ago, and they 15 years ago, they brought me in and said, hey, we are now majority minority, and yet almost all of our boards and commissions at the community level are still white, and we're having trouble engaging different, we're seeing lack of engagement in all populations. And so they really made an intentional effort to bring new faces in, to bring people from different backgrounds in. And, I just went back there about a month and a half ago. We had one of our listening sessions in the community, and it was just great to hear that, that was one of the few communities that really wasn't struggling with recruiting volunteers. They really were having a lot of success, and not only recruiting volunteers, but recruiting diverse volunteers. And kind of asked them what their secret was. And I think they've been very good at utilizing social media, especially amongst the different community groups and different different amongst cultural groups and things like that had connections, presenting need and showing the need, and then showing the value in the community, and really just when they presented the need, they would get people to step forward very easily, and have been successful at doing that. So I think, unfortunately, so we've been trying to demonstrate that to other communities, show how important it is on the front end to engage, to keep our groups and our boards and our commissions and our all of those ways that people touch a community, that they are representative of the community, because that is how you build engagement. That's how you build community.
Yeah, that's great. It's really good to hear some specific examples like the ones you mentioned, Adam. I also want to mention that Stephanie in the chat has added some additional ideas from her experience with Siuslaw Vision. So if other folks have specific things they've done that have been affected, please feel free to throw those in there so that we can all benefit from our collective knowledge. Heidi, did you want to add anything based on your experience to this topic?
I wonder if I'll answer all of the questions you asked with the same answer over and over again. I really feel like that this is a capacity and an intentional skill. And I know from our own experience at RDI to maybe strengthen what Maria was saying, is that it is really meant that we are looking at our own capacity to be welcoming, to be community responsive, and to ensure that we have those skills and have opened up those blind spots in our own work. So I will just say that I think these are in our skills and capacities that can be built, and so, but that needs to be intentionally focused on. I also very much like we've been asked the question about, like, how do you work in rural, and how do you this mystery that is rural. I get that asked that all the time, and one of the answers is hire rural people, right? Like, and engage the community that you're like. They're your staff. They're not just volunteers. And so I just say that the expertise is super valuable. And so I would piece that together too. I love, and I will just kind of just put a star on the concept of, focusing intentionally on engagement, and just focusing on these things, that they just don't happen the way that they used to anymore. I think we do have to be intentional and recognize these are capacities that we have to build, muscles we have to build.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do want to mention before we move on to sort of a different topic that RDI, our next community conversation, is scheduled for December 14th, and it specifically addresses strategies for outreach to Latinx or Latino communities. So if you're interested, pencil that in to your calendar if we still do that penciling thing. So let's move on to a little bit different topic. I'm wondering if our panel can talk about, in your experience, what volunteer management models or approaches do you see as most impactful? I know Adam has some experience with some different models that he talked about as we were getting ready for this session. So I'm wondering, Adam, if you would mind starting us off.
Sure. And I'll preface with saying that there isn't a right answer. We work with a lot of communities that do. The one consistent thing is that if you know one community, you know one community, and they all do it a little differently, and whatever works. So we are definitely support making sure what works with them, or, but from our capacity, we see the biggest need, especially in rural areas, is capacity. Yeah, I'm working with more urban communities. It might be figuring out how to engage an employee that wants to do more, have more positive impact, and so they're looking more skill-based volunteering and things like that as an engagement strategy. It's more of a theme that we see in urban areas. And in rural areas, it's just they need bodies in a lot of areas. For example, I am, as I said, from a town of 750. I'm a soccer coach. I'm a field maintenance worker. I'm a burger flipper. I'm a ticket taker. I'm a chair of a board, and I think only one of those actually connects to any of my skills. So I do the best. I don't know anything about soccer, but I try. I think, so. And in each of those cases, I was asked. There was a need. I was asked, and so one of the things that we've had success with in working with communities, we a couple different ways. One is we need to get people to ask, right, and figure out how to build that capacity, even on the volunteer management side. So we've used national service as a strategy to into rural communities, getting them VISTA members or AmeriCorps state members, and whether it's the school or the city or the organization there, to help them with building their volunteer management capacity, to start engaging people in these needs in these areas. So we have more people asking. And then another one is we've used just amongst organizations, whether it's the community or city themselves, or the organizations within a community. We've used a service enterprise model, national ANSA points of light model. I do believe it was actually started in Oregon and California on the West Coast there, as a handful of years back. But it's been a good, kind of a change management strategy. Often it's used in an organization, and thinking about how everybody in an organization can utilize volunteers in their work. So not just one function, like we have volunteers do take care of the dogs at the animal shelter, and everybody else just does their job. But really, the accountant uses volunteers to help with accounting, and everybody's using volunteers to increase their capacity to do more, and really think about them. Everybody thinking about their role as a volunteer management in an organization. We've taken that model and actually used it at a community level, and done community cohorts, which have been really successful. And where communities, which we all know that rural has overlapping themes and overlapping uses and needs, and it's not just one organization providing a function. Often there are many different organizations working together to serve a community. And so that way, that they can think holistically and going to go through a cohort together, and really, think about how they're utilizing volunteers, and pulling from different populations and pools to work together in their roles for that community. So just a few different models that we've found successful in Iowa.
That's great, Adam. And I appreciate the litany of volunteer jobs that you have that you shared with us. I'm sure there are a lot of people on the call that can relate. Heidi, do you want to make any additional comments on the idea of models or approaches, and whether these need to be adapted to rural specifically? Or
I'll answer that question last, because I think the answer, well, maybe I'll answer it first. It always needs to be adapted to rural, right? Like it's just, I've never seen something come in and just be, and not only does it have to be adapted for rural, and the idea of like doing, like, I love the man in North Central or in Central Washington who's like, I'm an economic developer, but all the people I graduated with are doing economic development differently than I am, because they're in urban spaces. And I think that's just across the board, that things are different there, but also it is that each of those communities make it different as well. So that's, I guess, probably what I would say about that. I am really thoughtful right now about our program, the leadership program that we have. This is a beloved program, right? And it's, as we launch it into this years in 2022 and potentially into the future, we've really focused the building of community leaders. And I sometimes use leaders and volunteers as the same word. I think that that's often what it is, but that program has been really focused. It's focused now differently than it used to be, right? You and I had a conversation, Jennifer, yesterday about us focusing, kind of getting away from the getting things done. And there's nothing wrong with getting things done, and we certainly still intend to with that program, but away from the project and the idea of how do we get things done versus how do we understand what the needs related to engagement and some of our own communities' very important projects and issues, and how do we engage and bring more volunteers into it, bring more resources into it, and what do those communities need? So this shift is, it just doesn't even fit anymore. I go into a community and I think about standing up that leadership program there, and a project-based piece doesn't even work anymore, because the major problem, the screaming out loud thing is, we need more people here doing, and to learn how to do our transitions and to connect us to one another so we know what that looks like. So I would just say, if you ask me what the best way to build volunteers is, I will always say it's the best way I've ever known is rural community leadership, but and those cohort models, to what was being said before, but even that has to be tweaked at this time. So to meet this moment, to meet these times and this context we're in.
So these cohort models are interesting because they sort of create this opportunity for connection among groups of people that have somewhat common interests, but may have diverse experiences and bring different things to the table, and kind of create opportunities for connection and sharing of skills. And yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it happens in the margins, right? Like he's training volunteerism specifically. I'm training community economic development and all sorts of other things. But in the margins, there's the conversation about what volunteers needs there are, or what problems we're having related, and there's this matchmaking that happens just naturally in the margins when you can bring people together.
Yeah, I agree and have seen it happen. Maria, is there anything you wanted to add from your experience about approaches or models?
Absolutely. I love the notion of building capacity through a cohort leadership model. I think that you get to exponential opportunities for the community. And so just tying that back to models that are used across the country, and I'm sure internationally, around volunteer engagement, I think that yes, absolutely, everything has to be adapted for rural communities, because most of the time we're working with less people resources, right? So a model like Service Enterprise, which is fantastic, has, I think, 10 different components that might be led by 10 different people. And in rural America, your nonprofit organization that you are leading might have only three active nonprofit board members and maybe only 2 full-time staff. So how do you approach that framework? So one of the things that I think, 2 things that are part of any, I think, successful engagement framework is, first and foremost, understanding that it takes resources to gain resources, right? So I think one of the learnings that we've had at Community Resource Center is we need to approach our volunteer work much like we approach our development work, which means, and I've heard this by both speakers, that it's across the organization. People are committed to advancing volunteer efforts, talking to volunteers, recruiting volunteers, from the brand new staff person all the way to the board chair, and that this is the long game, right? If we recruit a volunteer to do a skill-based task and it takes 3 months out of the year, let's make sure that they're available in the next year. So back to that relationship, right? Which again, more aligns with maybe a development function or how we approach development functions within a nonprofit organization, but it is equally as important. And people power, in my opinion, can often be leveraged in a much longer way than even dollars, right? because people bring lots of assets with them, their networks, other volunteers. So I think that underpinning of that volunteer engagement isn't something that you do a couple times a year or you focus a little bit of time on. If you are thinking about it holistically throughout the year, if it's part of someone's job, maybe a volunteer's job, that will get you farther. So I wanted to mention that. And then just tying back to what Heidi shared about connecting people, there's an activity that certainly we didn't make up at CRC, but we've used it with cohorts, and it's called the reciprocity ring, where people say, I need X. I need 4 volunteers to help paint a barn in a month. And they put it out to their cohort, and everyone gets a chance to share what they need, and everyone gets a chance to articulate, I can help you, or I know someone who could help you, or I know some volunteers. And it's just a great activity that starts to, again, leverage that network.
That sounds great. Reciprocity ring, is that what you said? That's great. So we've heard about reciprocity rings. We've heard about creating cohorts or other types of networks to connect people to one another, to help people understand that they're in this together and that there are opportunities for relationship building, which is what helps us get volunteers. We've talked about national service programs like AmeriCorps Vista and pulling those into community, and then also a skills specific model where you're pulling in, you're making a determination that you need accounting services or you need tree planting services, and trying to identify be more intentional and specific about the types of volunteers that you're needing. So these are all great things to get us thinking. We do have a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if any of our panel has experience with it and wants to address it. Mara from the city of Estacada is talking about working with the city, or I think we could probably speak more generally about elected officials. She's saying that they have events that are community events, and that the city or the county probably has ostensibly sponsored or owns, but then that they see a lack of engagement from elected officials in some of these types of events. Does anyone have a idea or a response for that they want to talk about?
I can certainly share, and I'm sure my colleagues have great additions. That is a challenge. I think it's always great if you have a champion on your committee or your commission who is willing to have those hard conversations. I know I played that role when I was the chair of our service commission here in Colorado. Also, when social media is used in events and there are missing people, that's always putting some pressure on. It's just great to have a champion. Sometimes that's a challenging task for an executive director, right? So when I need my board to show up, I go to my board chair, or I go to a funder, partner, friend. When I'm sitting on a board, I can be that champion. So finding those champions, I think, is really important. It also increases, potential interest in the work that you're doing by those elected officials coming, participating. But that's what I would add.
Mm-hmm. Adam or Heidi, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I just add that, leadership matters, and engaging those community champions it's important, and it's important in setting a value for a community and a town. So we definitely encourage it. We do trainings every year for like our League of Cities, and to really be intentional and stress the importance of community leaders showing that leadership. That might not be helpful at a town level, saying, but I would look at it just like any other volunteers. You have to be intentional. You have to ask them and get them and show them the benefit, and getting them engaged, and give them a job to do. Like we sometimes engagement is just like anything else. Say, hey, could you come to our awards thing and give awards to our volunteers or recognize our volunteers or something like that. Getting them engaged in that way can be a really helpful thing and can get them engaged in the work or the events of the, you know, and especially if it's their event, then they should definitely be engaged in that work.
Yeah, truth. Anything else?
Yeah, I'll throw in this concept of compassion. And I feel like that there's this moment when we're watching, right? There's the Great Resignation, there's this quiet quitting, there's the, what's the other one where it just like there, people have just decided that they have a different purpose in life and kind of purpose chasing. And I just pay attention to like, that's happening, and it's not happening to just that one guy, it's or girl or leader, it's happening across our nation. And I feel like there, maybe world, and I wonder, like, it might be a new reality we're in, right? And so instead of like forcing into the, like, what has to change for us to shift in a place where that we have put that expectation up, like Adam was saying, put that job description and are clear. But what also do we pay attention that we have to change, because maybe this is a new reality and I don't know. And so I guess I just want to pay attention to the moment when there's this need to understand what's going on and to be a compassionate leader of, here we are, and a thoughtful person to kind of not put our old world on this new problem, because this is new.
Mm-hmm. Truth. Great. Thank
And
you.
for
So go ahead.
one of the things that we found, and this is specific to government and elected officials or appointed officials, one thing that we found was really powerful is, of course, it's a little bit old data now, but in 2019, we did do an economic impact report of the nonprofit sector in Colorado. And of course, you know, we live in this world, we know that there's a huge economic impact, but that isn't not widely known or it wasn't known as it should be by a lot of our elected officials. And there's confusion. I'm sure everyone understands, you know, what is a nonprofit. And I always like to say, you know, nonprofit is a tax status, not a business plan. And we all know that the nonprofit sector was the sector that stood up and really supported communities throughout COVID. Elected officials really leaned on our sector to support community. And I think putting those numbers, that economic impact, in front of elected officials was very powerful. And we did see a shift in engagement across the board in rural and in urban communities. But part of that is really helping to share the story of the sector in your community, in your region, in your state, and those numbers were powerful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'd love to piggyback on that and say that in the Pacific Northwest, we also saw some really interesting partnerships between government and nonprofits. And to me, that feels like an opportunity right now. You know, I'm talking about relationship building, that we're assuming that some elected officials now have a renewed respect for what community support organizations can do on the ground to help with the work of public policy and with getting people the help they need. So that's a really good point. So yeah, Heidi.
Just small tangible things that I thought of as I kind of after I was talking of, it makes me think of, like, just because somebody's a champion to something or was involved with it, is like, that may not be their necessary skill set and or their interest. So like really being particular with when they're showing up, this isn't a general show up. It's like, what specifically is the piece of that it holds that person's interest? And I know you shouldn't have to you shouldn't have to do these things. You think these things, they're elected officials. But I also feel like if it's that interest piece and it's this, we're looking for purpose and meaning, matching purpose and meaning to the person. I also know that I often am giving pretty high level people volunteer jobs and asking them for favors. And I'm very specific about what I need. I give them a lot of tools for exactly the most impactful thing that I need from them. And I'm clear about that. They stand up and knock that ball out of the park every time. And so, you know, this small, tangible, clearly articulated, could you please just do this? And if you give them those roles, boy, they wouldn't not show up and do them, I would think. So, but it's this general, I think this general element of show up because you should. I'm not sure we live there anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so we have been talking a lot about this idea of being purposeful, and that building a volunteer base and retaining those volunteers is an activity that takes some time and attention and can't be something that you just do every once in a while as part of running your organization. Heidi, I'm wondering if you can help us talk about the why of that. So in other words, why is a purposeful approach to building a volunteer base important for community organizations? I think we've touched on this question a little bit, but I'm not sure if we've really answered the question of, you know, who cares? why be purposeful, or why why is that so important? What is it when we're talking about in the context of rural communities and we're talking about community vitality and making rural places better? Why is that important?
I got two. I was in Sweet Home just yesterday, Sweet Home, Oregon, 45 minutes north of our RDI's office, and having a meeting with the Rotarians, and in that community, and we're working in that community to stand up a leadership program for them, and a community-wide leadership program that the city is sponsoring and the city is supportive of, but it takes more than that. And in that community, there are, that I know of, there are 7 resignations or 7 transitions, right? There's a new mayor, there's a new city manager, there's an outgoing police chief and an interim coming in, there's a new superintendent, there is a new, did I say fire chief? There is a new middle school teacher, and I'm missing 4 of the other ones that are new. And I have this moment that's new right now, but that's not a new dynamic for rural. Like, we are constantly having turnover as people move into new positions, as people move in and out of communities, and it is the underpinnings of rural vitality that we continue to build our capacity, our human capacity, our intellectual capacity, our social capacities. These are in the work that we do, right? Those are foundational capitals or foundational wealth to getting anything else done. If you're looking for jobs, now to build the other wealth, right? Like jobs and workforce and innovation, that all comes from the built of these foundational capitals. And so you can let that atrophy. And it doesn't take long to atrophy. So if you're constantly, if it is one of your purposes, it's what you do in your community and you keep doing it, then you probably keep up. But the minute you stop doing, I see that atrophy. The other thing is that we ran the Rural Lead initiative this year, and talking about rural leaders and that element, and it would say the same thing. It would say that it is ongoing. It is building that pipeline of leaders so that you are transitioning that knowledge, transitioning the culture of a community as new people come on board, that you are, and sometimes it's even just the way you do that job, that I think you're transitioning, that you're moving that from new leaders, from existing leaders. So, and that's not something that just happens, because the direct cutoff of we just lost somebody, that's a big loss in a rural place. You kind of have to be constantly building your understudy, or somebody who can hold the interim role.
Right. So for example, if Adam moved they would need a lot of people to replace all of those jobs that he does.
That's right. That's right. And if he moved abruptly, right?
Yeah.
What all that intellectual knowledge, all that historical knowledge about the way things work, the relationships needed in community to make things work, that all goes with Adam.
Mhm.
Adam, you shouldn't leave. We should we should project that on you.
Sorry, I just thought that was such a great example that you explained that all the things that you do for your community. I keep coming back to it. Adam or Maria, did you want to add anything to the sort of the why or the community vitality aspect of volunteer recruitment and retention? Or do you think we covered it?
Heidi nailed it.
All right, excellent. Okay, so we're kind of getting into the home stretch here because we want to make sure that we stay to our hour for those of you who are just sneaking in during your lunch hour to listen to this conversation. I usually always ask a question like this at the end of these conversations because I want to give the panelists an opportunity to bring something into the room that they don't feel like we've covered yet. So I want to ask if you could leave our attendees with one piece of advice to help improve their ability to recruit and retain volunteers. What's like one short-term thing they can focus on, or one idea that they should keep top of mind? And Adam, you can go first if you like.
Sure. So yeah, I would say, and I said this earlier, but it's all about asking people and looking outside of your normal circles. There's hidden talents everywhere, especially in the work from home era. And I think that's something we didn't really touch on, that I think is important right now. And if Oregon and Washington and the Pacific Northwest is like Iowa, and I think it is in a lot of ways, we have a lot of, there was a lot of rural needs that were having trouble in a commuter world, where more people were economies were regionalizing, and a lot of people are driving 45 30 minutes into work some places and living in rural communities. And as people are kind of transitioning to more work from home, and people are moving to these rural areas even farther out from the commuter range, and looking, because they can live anywhere now, we're seeing more people moving into to older housing stock and places into rural communities. That's a huge new opportunity for rural. And those are people that might not have the same connections, and that might be new to a community. I'd have a whole new set of talents, and I think that's a huge opportunity. And they might have availability, especially when thinking of like rural fire and rural EMS, and that they aren't commuting, they're not in a different town, working in a different town, that they might be available. So I think that's something that we're really focused on here. And how do we tap into that?
Yeah, I like the idea of sort of this concept of invitation, and people forget that how powerful it is just to convey upon someone that you think that they're qualified to help their community, and they may not have thought of that before. So Maria, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Sure, and I did touch on it earlier, but I do think it would be my best advice to anyone, and that is to approach volunteer engagement like you approach development. You're building your human capacity, which I believe actually is more powerful than dollars. And if you can think about this in the long game, that human capacity will pay off, building those relationships, making sure that you are investing over the course of a year or more into building out this human capacity, will serve you well.
Yeah, I love the idea of considering sort of volunteer recruitment and retention and development in the same sort of mindset. So you have a donor base that you're trying to establish and cultivate. There's the same thing that could be said for your volunteer space. And I imagine a lot of your volunteers might become donors and vice versa. So it makes a lot of sense to do it that way. Heidi, what about you? Do you want to give us one last piece of advice or any last thoughts?
Yeah, because if I wasn't going to say do it intentionally, right, and build that capacity, I will. I love what Maria said, and I think that's true, right? Like that is the. Do you have a volunteer recruitment, retention, and maintenance plan? Do you have that plan? Have you written it down? Have you thought about strategically who are the 4 people you need and who would make the difference? Have you written those job descriptions? Right. I think it's serious business to bring on volunteers, and a great volunteer in a rural community could make, heck, they could make the difference about whether you have volunteers or not, if you put them in the right role, or in that role. So I would say that, but those are skills to build. That's internal tasks and capacity of your own organization to do. And I really just think it doesn't happen. So to do it intentionally, but also the culture of volunteers in the community, and the idea of actively rebuilding our sense of community in small places as we open up the world. And evidently the pandemic's over, you said in the room when we were doing, it's like, okay. But as that happens, I think this active rebuilding of community and the sense of community is important too.
That's great. Okay. There's I'm just reading the comments and the questions about also making sure that we do outreach to youth, and that makes sense for a whole lot of reasons. So I appreciate that comment as well. Okay, so as we wrap things up today, first of all, I want to thank our fabulous panelists, Maria, Heidi, and Adam, for spending the time with us today and offering their great perspectives and knowledge. A couple housekeeping details. In addition, I mentioned to you earlier that on our next community conversation on December 14th is going to be around outreach to the Latinx Latino community. So be looking out for that in your email inbox if you want to join us for that. In the interim, I will mention, because I know we have a lot of nonprofits in the room, that we're getting ready to start our proposal writing series, which also includes organizational readiness for proposal writing, called Ready, Set, Grant. If you're interested in joining us for that, you can check out our website, and Jess was kind enough to go ahead and throw the link in the chat. If you're interested in that, we would welcome you to join us as well. You'll be seeing a lot more of me if you wanted to do that class. I don't know if that's a selling point or not. So in addition, we did record the session today, and so watch your email inbox for a session recording link. And we are so pleased that you joined us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.